Welcome to the Adams State Podcast. I'm Mike Clifford. Today, we're talking with Mathew Sharples, Ph.D. He's an assistant professor of biology here at Adams State, and he's had a recent publication. I forgot to write down the name of the journal, but the title of the article is The Paraphyly of Stellaria, Alsine, Caryophyllaceae, necessitates taxonomic readjustment. Is that anywhere close to pronouncing it correctly?
You did pretty okay, and thanks for having me, Mike.
Yeah, glad to do it. So, can you, I think we were discussing a little before we started recording. I can get necessitates taxonomic readjustment a little bit. It sounds like you need to, and I actually read the executive summary or the whatever they call it, the abstract. Thank you for the paper. That you're talking about a certain kind of plant and taking it from one classification to another that closer to what it really is.
Mm-hmm. So this is a recurrent pattern in the carnation family, Caryophyllaceae. Mm-hmm. That's the technical name for the carnation family. A lot of people are familiar with the cultivated carnations that find their way into florist shops and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of wild species of carnation out there that very few people are familiar with, may not even notice at all, may almost dismiss as a grass or just some kind of a common weed. But this group, a lot of them look similar. And this group, carnation family, characterized by lots of what I would call parallel evolution. So evolution upon a similar form or morphotype or morphology or phenotype, if you will. Similar appearance, despite not being each other's closest relatives. So that specific paper addresses, based upon genome-wide evidence, so evolutionary reconstruction of these organisms and their history based upon genome-wide evidence, so comparison of genomes, essentially. That's how we reconstruct evolutionary history, by comparing DNA sequences and now entire, genomes. We have the power to do that to some extent now. And the concept that this paper is based upon is that kind of evolutionary similarity based upon DNA similarity, DNA composition similarity. What I found in this paper was that similar species were being lumped into one name called Stellaria alsine. That's the namesake of the paper. Turns out, Stellaria alsine refers to just one group of populations from mostly Europe and Western Asia. The other members of this group, previously being called Stellaria alsine, they occur in East Asia and throughout much of North America, especially East North America. That's a classic pattern in biogeography, another field that I publish actively in. Turns out these East Asian, Eastern North American representatives, and yes, this lineage does occur in Colorado. I discovered that maybe 5 years ago now, that there's one occurrence near Netherlands known of this species. Unclear if it's naturalized or native, by the way. But this distribution of this other organism, East Asia, Eastern North America, seems to be mostly a native distribution. Previously, those lineages being called Stellaria alsine, turns out they're not even remotely related to the entity known as Stellaria alsine in Europe, and parts of Western Asia for that matter. They are weedy species, so they do get dispersed by modern commerce and so on and so forth. Tiny seeds that get stuck in mud and boots and whatnot. It's almost unavoidable these days. They're not even closely related, though. So this other lineage, Eastern Asia, Eastern North America, required a new name, therefore, to distinguish them as different species, not even closely related species. I see this time and time again in the carnation family. Recurrent parallel evolution upon very similar form. I've actually studied loss of petals in this lineage, which occurs over and over again in this genus Stellaria. seems to be a common ecological pressure worldwide, pushing these species to lose their petals. And I could talk more about that in a bit if you want, but
Sure.
It's all based upon genetic evidence.
Yeah.
And then I had to go and look if there's a previously occupied name for this lineage occurring in East Asia and Eastern North America. Turns out there is, Stellaria undulata, which refers to wavy margins on the leaves, which is one slight, subtle morphological feature that actually helps distinguish these things now that we know they're actually so different evolutionarily.
Yeah. And
They've
it's
actually
that,
been separated for probably close to, I would have to go look at my data, but millions of years.
wow.
After millions of years, they've converged upon this similar morphology or appearance. And we reconstruct those times with fossil evidence, is in part how that works.
Okay. And so is this something where originally these plants, these carnations, were classified based on, like you say, the morphology, the way they look, I don't know, number of leaves or something like that. But then when you look at the genetics of it, they're not related at all.
That's pretty much exactly what's going on. The flowers are extremely similar. The leaves are very similar, except for those little crisped or wavy margins. Multiple synonyms in botany for describing these things. Crisped, wavy, undulate. Undulate refers to the actual specific epithet now being occupied. Stellaria undulata. It's a good name. It actually refers to some distinct character about the leaves. Florally, fruit-wise, roots, ecologically, they are very similar otherwise.
And you were saying that that's parallel evolution. Is that something, a result that they're coming up in similar environments or something, or how does that work?
It happens most commonly via some kind of common ecological pressure in unrelated groups. The classic example of this, of course, being spininess in desert plants. Got the cactus family and the euphorbia family. Cacti only live in the New World, so North and South America. They don't naturally occur elsewhere except for one species in Africa. May have actually originated the whole cactus lineage. Cacti made it across the Atlantic somehow and exploded into something like 2,000 species across North and South America, mostly in the desert regions, of course. And then euphorbs, they're more still restricted to the Old World. They are highly speciose or abundant in species numbers in Madagascar, for example, and in southern Africa generally. And they look very similar to cacti, some of them. They're succulent. They have spine-like structures. They've converged upon similar morphologies, parallelistically, if you will, based upon a common pressure. In this case, it would be being eaten by herbivores. You got to protect yourself as a desert plant. There's so many ways of protecting yourself as a desert plant. Spininess or pokey parts, whatever you want to call them, being just one of those types of adaptations. That's a classic example, but the more we look, the more we see this just a common theme across evolutionary history, especially in plants, but also in less charismatic animals, various beetles and insects and so on and so forth. Beetles are insects, of course.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, that is interesting. And you were talking about the number of petals on the carnations too? Or?
Yeah, this is actually a common phenomenon in this genus Stellaria specifically, but also other groups of carnations. It happens time and time again. Not so much in the true carnation lineage, which is called Dianthus. Those are the cultivated ones. Not a lot of other members of this family, carnation family, being cultivated or of economic or horticultural importance. So there's 2,000 or so wild species out there that are, not generally seen by the general public in general. They're subtle, they're slight, they have tiny flowers. This group Stellaria, a lot of them have flowers that you might notice, maybe 1 centimeter long, maybe 2 centimeters maximum. I would have to go reference the paper from 2021, but it was over a dozen losses of petals reconstructed across the history of this genus Stellaria. These are complete losses of petals. They go from 5 petals to having none at all. And that's because, and this has been experimentally demonstrated, just in a small system on Niwot Ridge above Boulder, Boulder County, at the Mountain Research Station, we did this work. We conducted an experiment in the wild comparing one species with longer petals that are showy, so to speak, visible to both humans and pollinators, and then one species that completely lacks petals, although there's some genetic aberrance here and there where there's maybe one little tiny, almost a crude petal, vestigial petal manufacture. This genetic machinery does not completely go away, and there's reasons for that. But the one without petals on Niwot Ridge has transitioned to a self-pollinating, predominantly reproductive strategy. It no longer needs to attract the pollinators that the species with the longer petals must. And yeah, some species do better with inbreeding than others. It's inbreeding, as Darwin noticed 150 plus years ago now, does not confer fitness or advantage into populations. Across the board, animals or plants. Outcrossing is beneficial, so getting as much diverse genetics as possible is beneficial across the board. But in the absence of reliable pollinators, it may be advantageous to mostly transition to a self-pollinating reproductive strategy. Not to say that outcrossing never happens again. Because insects are still interested in all types of flowers in general. And I've actually noticed that rain pollination seems to be something of a factor in some of these systems, at least, and in this specific system. I have not demonstrated that experimentally, but does seem to maybe at least facilitate some outcrossing amongst adjacent individuals. I don't know how the outcrossing across populations work, because this is a very successful species. Ecologically, it lives across the Rockies chains. It occurs across the Arctic in terms of Western North America and Eastern Asia. So it crosses the Bering Land Bridge, in other words, which no longer exists. Might come back if the glaciers come back. We're not sure if the glaciers are going to come back. It's not quite looking that way based upon emissions, but who knows? The Earth can tilt, and we have no say in it.
Right.
And it has been doing that for 3 million years,
Right.
recurrently, bringing on recurrent glaciations. Anyway, when the glaciers are present, there is a Bering Land Bridge that connects Asia with North America very directly. And there's unglaciated habitat there, so the organisms can kind of wait in limbo, if you will, for the glaciers to recede again. They don't know, of course, that the glaciers will be receding, but they find suitable habitat there in the meantime and can wait it out there, so to speak. Anyway, there's lots of organisms that show this connection between East Asia and Western North America in this case. This species occurs all the way throughout eastern Siberian mountains, across high mountains of China and Central Asia, and is even quite common in the Himalaya, where I've seen it in person and photographed it. That's an extensive geographic range for something that people might presume would be on its way out if it's so inbred, if its system is going to be facilitating it towards more inbreeding. There must be outcrossing along the way, but it must reliably still reproduce to maintain viable populations whatsoever.
Right.
So there's more work to be done in this system, but that seems to be what's going on with the recurrent losses of petals. Not only happening in alpine and other relatively harsh tundra habitats, which I should have explained, that's where Niwot Ridge is. It's on the alpine tundra. But seems to be occurring in desert systems as well, where drought years may totally knock out a lot of the pollinator communities.
Sure.
So this is a pattern in plant biology, flowering plant biology specifically, that in the absence of reliable pollinators, there can be pressure towards more self-pollination. Some lineages can't self-pollinate, though. They would have to figure out something else, like maybe a wind-based pollination system. Water is also increasingly more appreciated as a form of, or a vector of, pollination.
Sure.
And we can separate pollination into biotic, that's animal-based, versus abiotic, that's wind or water, not animal-based, not life-based. And the biotic vectors are diverse and numerous beyond common recognition, too. For example, lizards can be pollinators in certain tropical environments.
Makes sense. So all this research and the publications and everything, I'm sure they keep you interested in the field and everything, but what is that something that you're able to take some of this experience and information and use it directly in your teaching here at Adams State?
Oh, yeah. I implement my research into my teaching relatively frequently. I discuss concepts, of course, that are of relevance and interest to me, but while also maintaining curriculum standards, of course. These broader evolutionary themes, we haven't done so much work with the students on, but I have them engaged in other research and other courses. For example, in plant ecology, we went and compared various treatment types across the valley. So there's multiple treatments going on by public lands managers here in the valley. Let's start with an Alamosa specifically within the city boundaries. There's efforts to restore native willow habitat along the Rio Grande corridor. There's a lot of invasive perennial grasses, especially in the city limits. I'm not sure what the ranch lands look like upstream because I don't have as much access to those types of habitats. Sure. For obvious reasons, private land ownership. But in plant ecology, for example, compared the effects upon the vegetation community in the absence of restoration efforts, so just the feral kind of grass overtaken habitats of the Rio corridor, by the ball fields specifically. Then a little upstream from there, around the disc golf course area, there's active restoration efforts where they're planting coyote willow intentionally. We find that it seems to be working. The invasive species community is decreasing in percentage. So that's one interesting thing we found with the students just within city limits. We've also found on Forest Service land that there's plenty of mitigation efforts these days to kind of cut down densities of trees to reduce wildfire risk. In reality, prescribed burns are probably the best approach towards maintaining relatively undense understories of vegetation. In ponderosa pine habitat, for example, Douglas fir habitat, for example, we find that when the Forest Service goes in there and thins intentionally, compared to sites where they haven't thinned, at least there's no increase in invasive species composition. These are both relatively pristine areas, or habitat types when we compare them. When we look at the composition on the ground, thankfully, the Forest Service treatments are not bringing in new invasive species. Thankfully, that's the case. However, there does seem to be a little bit of an uptick in species diversity in the thinned areas. That could be for various reasons. Habitat heterogeneity, more access to light in certain parts of the forest.
Sure.
Probably part of what's going on. But the unfortunate part is when the Forest Service goes in there and intentionally thins with mechanization, they completely destroy the cryptogam layer. The cryptogam layer are the mosses and the lichens on the ground,
right,
on the soil surface. That has implications for soil-water relations. And it takes a lot of time for those cryptogam communities to build back up towards a stable state and probably retain lots of soil moisture at the end of the day.
Right.
In more shaded forests as the forest becomes less and less thinned over time, as it recovers, so to speak. So it'd be interesting for someone to go further study some of those ecological consequences.
Yeah.
We've done studies on Blanca wetlands too. The burning treatments out there do not seem to be increasing invasive species composition, for example. Last spring, a year ago, I taught plant systematics, which is really a survey of the flowering plant families and how to identify them. This is of direct applicability to our future public lands managers, which are a lot of the folks I'm working with in wildlife biology. They want to go work with the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Park Service, state parks, etc. A lot of them are already working in these jurisdictions early on, getting a head start. A lot of them know what they want to do already. And so they should have some rudimentary plant identification skills, and that's part of the reason why they would take a course like plant systematics for, increased job performance, if nothing else. But a lot of them come in interested in plants as well. I had them go collect various plants throughout the valley, and some of them turned up with new county occurrence records in their collections. Wow. These are of weedy species, so it's not exactly good news. These are exotic species that probably shouldn't be established here. There's a species of Veronica, common name speedwell, really abundant on campus here. No one had simply ever collected it from Alamosa County before until a couple students came along in plant systematics and both independently collected that species. Yeah. And now we can send it to museums so that we know that that species now occurs here. It's collected, it's vouchered, it's dried, it's preserved. It represents real life data. And we can do so many things with these types of records, including sequence DNA from extinct species. And a lot of my own work is based upon sequencing the DNA of these museum specimens. A lot of my work is not based upon fresh samples. Yeah. It's impossible to go find every species of a group that occurs across 6 continents natively, for example. That's Stellaria. Another student found a new record of pansy, viola, violets in, I believe it was Rio Grande County, if that's where Monte Vista is.
Yeah, yep. Yeah. Well, I think especially, well, it feels like the area here has got to be especially abundant in things to do with that kind of research. And I'd love to talk more and more about it, but we only have so much time. So, but I am going to ask you if you have anything else quick that you want to make sure you let us know about before we finish up.
I would love to be invited back because I have more to say about plants in the South San Juan specifically. I gave a talk at the Colorado Native Plant Society meeting that occurred here on Adams State, I should say, back in September. I was invited to give one of the main talks, and I set up a nice comparison based upon my master's level work in the South San Juans, comparing the floras, the species of my own research base originally, with other people's work, friends of mine, one of whom unfortunately just passed away, who have inventoried the Sangre de Cristos extensively for their plant composition. So I could talk more about the comparisons between these two mountain ranges bounding our beautiful valley, and even a description of a new species from this region back in 2019 based upon some of that inventory work as well. So I'd love to continue the conversation, Mike.
We might have to do that. Yeah, it does sound interesting. You comparing the San Juans to the Sangres and everything, and new species and everything sounds interesting.
And that's not published work. It was only given at one presentation, so I think it should be further out there, some of those comparisons. Until or if I publish it. Maybe I could talk about it more in the meantime.
Sure. All right. Thanks. Well, thanks for talking with us today. Mathew Sharples, Ph.D., Assistant Professor of Biology here at Adams State. Again, thanks for talking with us.
Thank you.
You're welcome.